Hello everyone and welcome to the third class on the famine. To date we have looked at the years following or leading up to the famine. We've also looked at the main causes for the famine, and in the last class yesterday we took a look at the English or the government's response to the famine in Ireland. Now as always we're going to start today with our learning outcomes. By the end of today's class, you should know how many people died and emigrated during the famine. You should also know what coffin ships and the diaspora are, and you should also know three consequences of the famine. In the last video, we took a look at the failure of the potato crop and how this led to mass starvation. We also took a look at how many people died on the side of the road during these public work schemes to build these famine roads. But one thing that killed more people than both the famine roads and the blight in the potatoes or starvation was different diseases. And we're going to be taking a quick look at that next. Now, one of the main diseases at the time was a disease called scurvy. You may remember scurvy from our studies in the Age of Exploration. Now, people got scurvy from a lack of vitamin C from potatoes. They would have had loss of teeth, shrunken eyes, pale skin. In severe cases, this could actually lead to death. Now, two of the main diseases at the time that were the big killers were typhoid and yellow fever. So these would have been the main diseases. Now, they spread like wildfire inside in workhouses, where, as we seen in the last class, they had increased from 100,000 people to 200,000 people in capacity. So these diseases were spreading far faster inside in these workhouses. Now, bear in mind, in 1848, the amount of deaths had got risen to 1 million people, and because people were so weak, they were actually not able to bury people correctly. So they, instead of digging a 6-foot hole, they would usually only scatter a small bit of dirt on top of a person. This led to, when bodies decomposed, it actually led to more diseases spreading, and this is how typhus and yellow fever spread even more rapidly. As well as the loss of people through disease, we also lost over 1 million people, nearly 2 million people, to immigration. So immigration, it means when you leave your country, and in Ireland we lost a lot of our younger generation through immigration to head to other parts of the world such as America and England. Now, immigration had become a big part in life in Ireland, so it was actually quite common to immigrate from Ireland to go seek a better life in other countries. Now, this happened even before the famine, and it continued after the famine. So this wasn't just something primarily due to the famine. It actually started, well, it primarily started between the years of 1815. So between the years of 1815 and 1845, around 1.5 million people immigrated to the United States, Canada, Britain, Australia, being among the main destinations. Now, around 1 million went to North America and around half a million went to Britain. So that kind of gives you an idea of the sense of scale of the amount of people immigrating from our country to seek new and better lives elsewhere. Now, as people would head over to America, they would have what's known as an American wake. Now, this was if a son or a daughter were heading to America, it would be their final time ever seeing or talking to their parents or family members ever again, because they didn't have phones, they didn't have photographs back then, and the postal service wasn't as good as it is now. So this would have been their final farewell to their family members, and they would have bagged up everything that they owned, all their possessions, and they would have said farewell. It would have been almost like a wake, like a funeral that we would have, where you remember all the good times you had together. So this was a very important part of culture in Ireland back in the famine era. Now, during the famine, the immigration rate exploded. Okay, so it increased hugely. So between the years of 1845 and 1850, immigration increased by 1 million, 1 million people immigrated from Ireland during those 5 years. Between the years 1850 and 1860, another million people had immigrated. So we had 5 years in the first one. We also had 10 years here. Another million people migrated. And just in 1 year alone, in 1847, one of the worst affected years, 250,000 people immigrated. Now, just to give you a bit of perspective, Cork City has around 124,000 people living in it. So if you take a look at this 1 year alone, it'd be as if even double Cork immigrated in 1 year. So it'd be like if all of Cork just got up and said, "Heck this, we're going abroad, we're going over to America, or we're going to England," and they all left. So that's very, very important to think of. Also, if you take a look at our whole population, if 2 million people left our country in the morning, we would look like a very, very different type of country. Okay, so it would wipe out nearly half of our population over the span of your life, or over the span of, yeah, roughly around 15 years. So you have around 10 years here and you have 5 years here. So in the span of around 15 years, you would have half of the population in Ireland, which is kind of scary to think of. Now, here we can actually see a very, very interesting primary source, and it is a ticket for a ship heading to New York. So if we take a look up here, we see the title of the ship, which is called the Dunbrody. The ship is designated to head towards New York, and it's actually leaving from New Ross. So this is actually a very, very interesting ticket because it gives us a kind of idea into what things look like back then. We can see here the three passengers that are under this ticket. They were between the ages of 21, 23, and 15. So this was clearly a family of, as you can see, their second name is all the same, but they would have been a group, families, but they actually didn't have the parents with them. Now, if you think about it, the travel on these voyages, it would have been very, very expensive. So we can see here £9 and probably 15 shillings at the time. That would have been highly expensive, and it would have been very difficult for people to afford this and to pay for this. So this would have only been wealthy families that would have been able to afford it. Down here we can see the date, which is 1849. I think that's March, and I'm not too sure of the date beside it, but it's actually interesting to see a snapshot into what their tickets would have looked like back then, and even just to see the ages of the people immigrating. So some of you may be around the age of 15. So if you think about it, if you were this Richard that was getting on top or getting onto the ship, and you were going on this voyage over to New York, and you didn't know what to expect because you'd never seen any photos of it, you didn't know where you were going, you were leaving your family behind, all you were going with was your sister and brother, Margaret, I think it is, and Larry. So you would have been leaving all your family behind because there was no point on the mother and father going, because the tickets would have been so expensive for them to go, and they would have been leaving their home. So a lot of the time, families would use their whole life savings just to send their kids abroad in hope of a better life. Now, not everyone was lucky enough to afford one of these tickets. A lot of people actually um, committed crimes, they robbed things, they committed murder just to get arrested and get sent over to Van Diemen's Land, which was in Australia. A lot of people committed some heinous crimes just get sent on one of these coffin ships over to Australia or into foreign countries to try and escape Ireland, because they've seen it as a better option than dying in Ireland of starvation. So it's kind of interesting just to see one of these tickets and just to know that this would be a primary source from the time. Here we can actually see an example of one of these coffin ships. Now, I'm sure you can all guess why they were called coffin ships, and we'll be getting into that in the next slide. This is a replica that was built of the Dumbrody that we talked about in the last slide. So this would have been the ticket that that family were buying a ticket on board. Now, as you can probably tell, this is not a passenger ship. It wasn't designed to carry passengers, it was designed to carry cargo. So this ship, even though it looks like a pirate ship in my opinion, it was to carry logs across the ocean from Canada to the likes of England, to carry goods such as tea around the world, and it wasn't designed for carrying people. But what they would do is they would carry logs, carry tea or spices into Ireland, sell all those spices either in Ireland or England, and while they were venturing back across the ocean, they would decide to charge people to jump on board and actually gain entrance into America. So this is how they made money on their voyages back. Now, in this artist's rendition of or depiction of the coffin ships, we can kind of see a glimpse into how crammed these ships were. So you can see down here in the cargo bay where they would store timbers, people are actually sleeping and living during this time. We can see here where there would have been 3 or 4 to 1 bunk, and people would have been sleeping on top of each other, and it was very, very cramped conditions. Now, as you can imagine, this is what sparked off a lot of diseases on these coffin ships, and many people actually died. They said that only or around a third of the passengers will be dead by the time they reach their destination. This was due to hunger and that they didn't have enough food, due to poor living conditions and diseases, or else due to malnourishment by not having enough water or starvation. It was also rumored that sharks used to actually follow these ships all the way to their destination because so many people would be thrown overboard. Now, the sharks would follow along so that once they threw people overboard, they would be able to get a free snack and continue on their way. So, what was the result of the famine? So if we took a look at it on a graph, we can see here that it's looking at the population, and these are the years between the 1700s to the 2000s, and it would have increased from 2 million all the way up to just above 8 million. Now we can see here around 1845, just in this area up here, where the population was just above 8 million, and in the span of 5 years, so between 1845 and 1850, Ireland lost 2 million people. So this red section here is what we consider the Great Famine. Now, those 2 million people, a million would have been through starvation, hunger, diseases, everything that happened in Ireland, and another million of that population would have been due to migration. Now, as we can see, there was a steady decline as the years continued. This was as a result of the famine and Ireland trying to get back on track. We can start to see here where the graph is starting to go up, that you can nearly see that it started increasing around the time where Ireland joined the European Union, and Ireland started actually doing quite alright for itself, but we'll be learning about that in a later class. The Irish diaspora. So it's very important when we're talking about the population around the world that we know that it's the Irish diaspora. Another consequence of the Irish famine was the decline in the Irish language. So we can see here the green indicates where counties that were Irish speaking, and it predominantly affected the west of Ireland. So we can see here where the majority of Ireland would have spoke Irish. In under 50 years, even half of that was taken away. Another 50 years and that was halved again, and now all we're left with is some small Gaeltacht scattered around Ireland, such as down in Kerry, Galway, Sligo, some small little pockets around the country that speak Irish. Now these are a kind of heritage sort of thing now, and it's kind of like a sense of their identity, but it's interesting to think that in 200 years how far we have changed in our country. Another consequence of the Irish famine was that subdivision ended. So now instead of the family farm being able to be divided up into different sections for the different family members. Now it wasn't until the father passed away and the eldest son was given the land, and he had to wait until the death of his father to marry and get the land for his own family. And the final big consequence that we'll be talking about the Great Famine was the hatred of the British government. So this was the hatred from the Irish people towards the British government and towards their control, as it was famously put, the Almighty or God indeed sent the potato blight, but the English created the famine. Now this was how they viewed the English, and that they took a very bad situation for the Irish and actually made it worse. So this was down through the laissez-faire approach and towards not handing out charity to the Irish, and towards their slow approach of actually giving any assistance or help. So that brings us to the end of today's class. By now you should all know the people that died and immigrated during the famine, or sorry, how people died and immigrated during the famine. You should also know about coffin ships and the Irish diaspora, and you should know 3 consequences of the famine. Okay, I hope this helped, guys. Best of luck.